So welcome along. Fantastic. If you're watching this in a recording, forget the next 10 seconds. But if you're live and on the call right now, then I encourage you to go to menti.com and log on. You'll be faced with a screen that says, that asks you to input a code. If you input 6184769, as it says on the screen at the moment, and then submit, and that will let you in, because we've got a few things to be kind of running through just now, and I would encourage you to take part because it's always really interesting, and it adds certainly enriches what we're talking about now. So we're talking about conflict, and for those of you that were on the DISC profiling call 2-3 weeks ago, you'll know that I was a high I. Lots of salespeople, people that used to presenting all the time, as my wife Tracy would say, people pleasers. I'm a high I, and some of that means that actually I'm not at all comfortable with conflict. Even now, after 30 years in sales, there's something about me that just wants to kind of roll up in a bit of a ball. I really don't like it, and I have to really sort of steel myself, if you like, to pluck up the courage to engage in conflict. And as an example, just prior to this call, Nigel and I had discovered that I hadn't told Nigel something, and so we got to that bit, not head to head because we're much too respectful of each other for that, but I'd forgotten to tell him that we needed to finish at 12 o'clock sharp. Because sometimes when I work with Nigel, we have a few minutes, we go over time because there's always people that want to ask extra questions, and it's always good, but unfortunately we have to finish 12 o'clock on the nose today, 12 o'clock UK time on the nose today. So I would encourage you to get involved with Menti. There are going to be people coming in, we'll let them in as we go, but I would encourage you to stay on video if you can, and on mute. If you want to use that QR code to get you in. I'm going to introduce Nigel now. Nigel Smith has been in project management for a number of years, right, Nigel? And I've worked with Nigel probably for 18 months off and on, participating in workshops. He knows loads about the people aspects and communications and projects in a really structured and if I may say, really professional manner. I do stuff from intuition, which means I find it really difficult to write down what I do. But Nigel has got just such a amount of data to bring onto, let me just admit someone, to bring onto calls like this. You can really bring stuff to life. So again, if you've just joined the call, please do go to menti.com and input the code. If we could just, so the code is 6184769. Maybe helpful to write that down. Got someone else coming in. Maybe helpful to write that down just in case your phone locks. So again, if you just joined the call, go to menti.com. Nigel, if that's okay with you, I'm going to hand over to you, and you can pick things up from here. We're talking about conflict. So fantastic. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you so much, Keith. And just to get everyone into the groove with what we're doing with Menti, it's at the top of the screen there, 618476.9. Just really want to know where you guys are joining us from today. I know we've got some European people. I think Enrica's calling us from Italy today, so welcome. Just want to see where everyone is coming from.
Wow.
Excellent.
Oh, Paul are trying to get through here. There we go.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we're international today, which is wonderful. Welcome, Enrica.
Excellent. So we've got quite a broad spectrum there, Keith, of people coming in. And just as you do that, just want to share with myself, as Keith said, I'm a project manager by trade. I started in the automotive industry in the Midlands many years ago. and recently have retrained to be a coach and have melded the soft skills with the hard skills. And as Keith said, very interested in team dynamics, and particularly culture in organisations and what makes projects in particular work. But thanks everyone for your input to that question. I also want to understand what it is you'd like to get from today's session on conflict. It may be a broad understanding. You might want some detailed takeaways or some tips or strategies, whatever it is you want. If you can just enter some things in there, we'll make sure that we try and cover off as much of that material as we can this morning. Thank you. So I think I've got a bit of a text problem here. I think it's all coming out in white, which isn't why it's not being seen. So maybe if people could just unmute and just shout out what their expectations are, that might work better. I do apologise. A bit of a format issue I've got.
Okay, all right. Well, Nigel, I'll go first while everyone's doing that. But as I mentioned earlier, I kind of recognise when conflict is happening, but how do I get the courage, if you like? How do I dig deep, if you like, to get to that point where I'm able to, first of all, not get fleeced, but you know, how do I get to the point whereby I can engage in conflict to the point and get what I need from the discussion?
Okay. I don't know if anybody else just wants to unmute and just shout out what they wanted to mention at all. We'll see if we can cover that off in the next hour.
I just wanted to quickly say I've been in a lot of conflicts at work for several years as an employee, but now I've learned something, that how can we avoid conflict in the first place? In other words, not dodge him, but try and not create one.
Yeah.
Okay, great question there, David. And there is one surefire way of avoiding conflict, which I'll come on to. Just to come back to your former point, Keith, courage is the thing, one of the key takeaways that I think people are going to need today, combined with communication. But we'll go into that. Apologies for this slide, that's my mess up. But just so we get a measure of where we think we are right now in terms of 1 being quite low or poor, or 10 being quite good, where do you think you are on that continuum in terms of dealing with conflict? Okay, so we're sort of just below the medium, but there is 1 or 2 individuals that can deal with it quite well. So that'd be really great to come up into the conversation. For those of you putting your answers into chat, if you're able to go to menti.com and use that code, you can join in the interactive piece. And just to say, at the end of this session, all the details within this slide deck with everyone's input will be sent to you as a PDF and a permanent record of this session. So all the rich information that's in there will be shared afterwards. So typically, just looking at that, we're about halfway house in terms of, we don't necessarily like it, we don't necessarily thrive on it, but we know, I think as David has pointed out already, it's something that we're going to have to live with. So just to move on then, I just want to talk about the agenda I want to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. So I really just want to start to go into talk about what is conflict, where does it come from, why do we have it? And then talk about, actually, is it something that's negative? And I'll ask you a question about that. I actually want to bring today's session alive by making it really interactive. I'd like people to show the videos, to unmute and join in some of the conversation. I've got a few conversation pointers that will try and draw some points out as we go through this webinar today. And the key part, of course, is going through a few key tips and strategies. Now, actually, there's quite a few different ways you can handle, deal with, manage and navigate conflicts. And it is horses for courses. As Keith pointed out already, different people have different styles. And for those of you that were on the disc call 2 or 3 weeks ago, our styles and preferences also influence the way we deal with conflict. And sometimes it's self-awareness, and other times it's awareness in others that enables us to manage those situations. As we come to the end of the session, we'll do some reflective practice. So maybe what's the most important thing you've learned, you've heard, or you've said, and then I will leave some time at the end for a Q&A session. And if there's any questions that come beyond that, you can reach out to me or Keith post-webinar, and we'll do our best to answer the questions for you. So if that's all good, then just in a word, just one word, what would you say conflict means to you? I've noticed something in chat from Richard about disagreement in chat there, and it's become more and more commonplace. Confrontation from David again come through on chat. Frightened, scary, worry. Yeah, so pretty much some quite negative connotations in that sense. So it's something that naturally we feel that we want to avoid. I think as David pointed out from the start there. Yeah, stress is coming in there. Different opinion, excellent. Yeah, often it is because people are coming from different places, from different perspectives. Self-doubt, the classic story that we tell ourselves. So yeah, sometimes if you think something, thoughts or feelings, you think something negative, you can start to behave in a negative way. So thank you for that. And I guess that the next question is slightly similar to that one, in that if you've got all of these emotions going on, again, you're going to be in the threatened, worried, stressful type of state. So I'll probably take those answers in a sense to really answer this part here, because yeah, okay, we've got stressed again, real common themes coming through here. But I always think it's good to start a webinar with a phrase or a quote or even a definition. And today I've just gone for a straight definition here. So conflict comes from the Latin and the Old Middle English from confliere, which means come together with force, or strike together is sort of a literal meaning. So given the answers you've just given me right now, how essentially do you view conflict? Do you see it as something negative, or do you see it as something else? Okay, so we're going for the slight Pareto at the moment here. We've got a few coming through. On the whole, it tends to be quite negative. If you haven't yet gone to menti.com, please do so on your tablet or your phone and stick in 61 84 76 9. Notice a few people coming through on chat as well, so thanks Richard for that. It seems to be the majority is in the negative camp, so glass half full for that particular question. So thank you so much for that. And very often, all of us will experience conflict, be it at home, work, or play. But what actually is it? And very often people have put it mismatch of expectations. Thanks for that, Ralph. Developing into polarized views, absolutely is. But whenever our harmony of our own situation, our own world is threatened, or we feel disadvantaged, or where our values are conflicted, we will instantly feel conflict. And when our values are compromised, conflict is at play. So just for the benefit of Ralph, I'm just going to stick the Menti code back on the screen for just one moment. And of course, left unchecked with the negative connotations we've placed on conflict right now, you can of course get into a downward vicious circle where things start to get worse and worse. And this could be with a work colleague, it could be with a team, it could be in fact with your organization, it could even be within your own family unit. And of course we have to remember that most people don't leave their jobs, they leave their managers or their bosses. So relationship is absolutely key to all of this. And the bad news with conflict is that wherever you get people, you're going to get conflict, okay? But the good news is there are some things we're going to come on to which will enable you, through raised awareness and just thinking about things differently, to enable you to deal with handling conflict in a slightly different way. Now, we just saw from the poll we just did that roughly 80–85% of you guys think that conflict is actually quite negative, when in fact there is a positive side to conflict as well. It's a little bit like risk management. Whenever in project management terms I talk to people about risk, I ask them what do they mean by risk. They'll say, oh, if something's going to go wrong, it's a threat. But actually, even with a risk, there's something called an opportunity, which is a positive threat, of course, just looking at it from a different perspective. And the same is actually true for conflict. So the difference between positive conflict and negative conflict: in positive conflict, you will get people that will agree on the goal. Okay, they will agree on the goal, they'll disagree about how it's going to be achieved. Where you get negative conflict is where nobody agrees on the goal, and of course nobody agrees on the right way there. Just gives you a classic example from my own background of positive conflict. So as I mentioned before, my formative years are all in the automotive industry. I love cars. I drive a Mazda MX-5, and that car famously was brought to market in the late 80s with a conflicting style by the Mazda Automotive Corporation. They set up teams in America, UK and Japan to develop a two-seater sports car to beat the British MGs. That was its raison d'etre. And what that did, it created a competitive, conflicting element which brought lots of ideas together. And then the sum of the parts was greater than the whole in that sense. And they came up with a really great solution to providing a two-seater, sports car. So very often it can be, if it's harnessed in the right way, can be used for good effect. But as I think has already been pointed out, very often if there's a default position from one person, the other people are more likely to take offence if they're not part of that process. And negative conflict is all about dysfunction, hurt feelings, disrespect. And very often this can be a perception or an assumption on our own part. And for me, if it's almost like there's something that's not been said, an assumption anywhere really is a question that has not been asked. So going back to Keith's point from the start, what can I do to try and understand conflict a little bit better? Maybe one of the best techniques is really just to ask questions. And just moving on from that, sometimes opinions can come across and take us to a negative place, and it's best to deal in facts, of course. And if left and we go down this sort of vicious circle, we can end up where things fester and people become disenfranchised. And again, if you recall from the DISC webinar from a couple of weeks back, a certain introverted styles that will just completely withdraw. And one type in particular, which are more reflective and people focused, will be prone to outbursts of emotion and energy, which can also be equally disruptive as well.
Nigel, if I can just jump in there, and Enrica has made a great point in chat, which says if you can learn from a conflict, learning something about yourself, or if you want to get rid of the person, there's a translation thing, I think, but if you want to understand what the other person's point of view is, you have to go through that conflict process to get to the point where you can understand. I think it was a great point. Thank you.
Yeah,
Enrica.
and actually, Enrica, you're stealing my thunder a little bit, because there's a great example I want to pull out in just a while about different perspectives. But thank you for that point. And actually, it is about awareness of yourself and awareness of the other person. If you classically take the iceberg, we've all probably seen this scenario where we just see the tip of the iceberg and everything else just sits underneath. And sometimes what we see from the other person is just what we see above the waterline. What we don't see is everything else that's going on in their life underneath. We just make assumptions about all of that. And again, we're only seeing parts of the problem where actually we need to work towards more of a win-win solution for them. And I'll come on to explain later why I don't believe compromise is good in certain situations, because it effectively can be a lose-lose situation. But fundamentally, and I'm hoping now to draw out the key theme, the one key theme of this webinar today, what is it that you believe sits at the heart of conflicts. And I trust that I haven't got white text on here. Again, I apologise in advance if I have, but if you could just pump in what you feel on Menti sits at the heart of conflict, that would be really great. Thank you. Yeah, some great things coming through there. So values, definitely, you know, very often we look at corporate values of organisations we work in, and when that organisation is not central to what they believe in and what they state, we can often feel disharmony with that. Or where we're working for someone that doesn't exhibit those values, we feel that sort of disconnect. Ego, expectations, excellent. We've got some great stuff coming through there. Prejudice and yeah, probably bias as well. I think culture is a really great one. Culture pretty much is the way things are done around here, you know, the way you behave in an organisation.
Yeah, David has put in chat a different agenda or objective.
Yeah, and it's also key to point out at this point, thank you David and Keith for that, that some people live off conflict, and you will see that happen. You know, certain styles absolutely thrive on it, and they want to put people in difficult situations. And there really is only one way of dealing with that type of conflict, and that pretty much is to avoid it or remove yourself from it. But that, of course, comes with bigger consequences as well. But thanks for that, and also thanks for enthusiasm being pumped in there. Really looking at it from a positive perspective, because, of course, when you look at things from a different side, then very often you can see the different way through it. And what I'd like to just move on now is just to cover with you some key strategies. And this screen I've put up now is pretty busy. I can talk to all or most of these and just want to bring out some key themes. But what I'd like to start with, if everyone can see this, if you just want to unmute and just tell me what you think this is. Anybody?
Beach ball.
Beach ball. Everybody agree it's a beach ball? Just give me a thumbs up if you think it's a beach ball. Okay, so can somebody just shout out and tell me what you see on this beach ball?
Segmented beach ball with primary colours.
So which colours is that, Ralph?
Blue, yellow and green.
Okay, so Ralph can see blue, yellow and green, as I'm sure most of you can. I'm looking at the same beach ball, but actually I'm seeing red, white and pink. Okay, so that's what I'm seeing. Okay, but we're actually looking at the same thing. Very often, you know, we talked about looking from different perspectives a little bit earlier. If you're able to come from the other person's perspective to really understand what sits behind where they're at, you can very often get a different understanding of the same thing, but from their perspective. And equally, you can invite them to come to your position and point of view as well. So perspective shift is really, really difficult to achieve in some regards, because again, we've got our own egos, our own prejudices, our own values, our own beliefs, and of course the story we keep telling ourselves why we're right. You know, some people would rather be right than happy, and they're really difficult people to break down. But fundamentally, you've got to get under the layer of what sits at the heart of the conflicts, and you really need to understand what is the goal that needs to be achieved. Because if you don't have common agreements on the goal, then you're not really going to resolve the conflict. And even in a positive conflict situation, you can agree what the goal is, but you might still disagree about the method to achieve it. Okay, but I would take that in a positive way, because actually, at least then you're bringing things together. Remember the definition of strike with force, bring things together. And very often, and you'll see a lot of this more so in sporting contexts, where you've got, say, a coach or a manager that doesn't get on with a star player. Very often that can either go one of two ways, but on occasion it can actually improve the performance of both parties in spite of that particular relationship. So with that in mind, I don't know if anybody wanted to either talk to or just ask a question about anything that's up on the screen there, just so I can try and bring it to life with some examples or share some metaphors or stories with you at all. And I think just to start off, Keith, I'll come back to the one you started at the start of the session. For me, the heart of conflict, it's all around communication. And you have to be brave to be vocal, really. You need to be able to state your needs and concerns. And it really does relate to assumptions on the most part, because very often, if you assume something, you may be incorrect. And it's good practice just to check it out. And when you talk to another person, don't talk in terms of you never or you always. Talk from your own perspective and say, when this happens, I feel like X or Y. What you do then is you remove the other person, if you like, from the firing line, and you're making it personal to yourself, talking from your perspective. They've got a tendency to feel less threatened. Okay, so that's a useful tip on that.
Richard Gadd in the chat box has added in his experience, communication is the key enabler. And it reminds me, in my last sort of 10 years, I've been an interim manager, which means you go somewhere for 3-6 months generally to fix something. And I can tell you, out of 20 or so assignments in big companies and small companies, the one dominant theme from each of those, without exception, was people talking to each other, or rather they weren't talking to each other, was the common theme throughout each of those assignments. So it was almost my role as a stakeholder manager to just kind of keep people talking to each other. And it was not rocket science, but it was the central feature of each assignment. So great point, Richard. Yeah. Thanks for that.
And I would go as far as to say as well, Keith, I mean, in my day job as a project manager and coach, communication is 85% of my job, relationship management. And I think it's a key skill.
Sorry, 1 second. I would love to know, it's great to see Bobby Bradstock on the call. I would love to know how she kind of positions this with her clients. Bobby,
well, I actually have unmuted myself because I wanted to kind of ask a question or pose a statement to both, you know, yourself, Keith, and Nigel. But I've just obviously started my own company. You know, I'm a psychotherapist, so the client side of stuff in terms of the one-to-one stuff is kind of okay for me. But I've started a project working with young people. It's called the Value Youth Project, and it's going in schools and delivering psychoeducation. And I've got a group of volunteers that are working for me, and they're going in. But I've just read on that slide the word exploit, and I think that is something that really chimes with me. I think because I'm young, you know, I'm female, all of those stereotypical things for me, I think is what is in my narrative. In terms of that kind of story that I tell myself. And actually one of my concerns is that, much like with this first contract that I've got, is that they're going to try and get as much out of me as they can. And my absolute concern is, and what has happened so far for me, is that I kind of back down because I feel that I've got so much riding on this first contract with them that I don't want to, you know, risk losing them at any point. So it kind of feels as though I'm at that stage at the moment. And that's really what kind of caught my eye about this seminar, was that, you know, that conflict is really something that I really struggle with. Mm-hmm. And it kind of gets in the way of a lot of sort of communication with them, because I'm kind of backing down in the emails in a way.
Yeah, an exploit on there, Bobby, was really in the context of how we deal with risks as well. So when you've got an opportunity, you want to make it happen. You want to, you know, shorten that phase for it to come to life and give and deliver benefit. And in the same way with conflicts, if you're doing it from a positive perspective where you know the goal, but you don't know how you're going to get there, it's best to actually mix it all up. Now, just as a personal story, I'm quite a task-orientated individual. I'd call myself like a recovering perfectionist, really. So delegation for me is incredible, or was incredibly hard. Got a team of people, and maybe I didn't trust them as much as I trusted myself to do a really great job, but that wasn't my job to do that. It was for them to do it. So letting go was really hard. And the conflict for me came when they came up with better ways of doing it than I would, which clearly I had to accept. And I turned that into a positive to exploit the fact that these guys are creative. All I needed to do was to set the end goal and say, do we agree on this is what we're aiming for? And this is when we need it by. and then just let them get on with it, so I could get off and do other things, rather than classic typical micromanage and things like that, which is where I think somebody mentioned culture before on one of the previous slides. There's some very corrosive and toxic cultures which still exist, based around the blame and the fear culture, which don't allow any of these things to happen. It's all process, process, process. So I'm really glad you called out the exploit one. I'll put it with the enhance and share on the screen there, because I think there are times where you need to make things happen. If you talk about where we are in COVID right now, if we weren't actually enhancing and exploiting, we all know what the goal is. We want a vaccine, we want to get out the other end of it. There's different views and things which drive us towards that solution. But what it's doing, it's bringing people together to get stuff done. Who'd have thought we'd have got Formula One teams and vacuum cleaner manufacturers and specialist clothing providers like Barber coming up with all PPE and ventilators? It wouldn't have happened in normal time. Yeah. And how many years of legislation would it have taken in the UK, if not all of the world, to make working from home a policy? It probably would never have happened. So all these things come together, and it's needs must, and very often you just have to appreciate the other perspective or the other particular argument for the greater good. And just on that, as I just look over this screen that I put up myself as well, very often when we talk about communication, people will communicate not only what needs to happen, but they may not say why. And very often, if you give the why, which is the motivational goal, and you do it in the right way, people will put up with the how. Okay, so again, COVID's another great example. We're in this situation because, and this is what we're going to have to do. None of us like it, but we're sort of putting up with it. And often, you know, you could say we're all in the world of Zoom at the moment. And actually, is that good or bad for communication? Well, I guess it depends where you come from. For me personally, there's no substitute better than face-to-face conversation. This is as good as it gets, but equally, you still don't get that natural rapport. You don't really get to see the whites of people's eyes and understand them in a better way. But it's the best we've got right now. So it is a little bit of a compromise, really. And as I just look across the screen as well, I think for me, response versus reaction is also something that's really big that calls to me. And, you know, very often you just need to quote Newton's third law, really, which, you know, is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So, you know, if you react in a certain way to an event, the size of that event becomes the size of your reaction. And just a simple example from that is, when you're driving on the motorway and you get flashed in the outside lane to pull over and you're being harassed, you might decide to pull over, then pull back out and chase the other guy down the motorway and just be completely dangerous. Now that's a reaction. And of course, all the emotions that go with that sort of make that situation worse. Whereas on the other hand, you could just respond and say, okay, I'm going to pull in, get out of the way and just let this guy get on with it. And then you're really calm. Okay, you don't know what's happened to his day. You don't know what sits underneath his iceberg. You know, so sometimes it's all about not reverting to normal type, because our brains are still primitively wired between fight or flight, and there's nothing in the middle. So we're either one way or the other.
If I can, Nigel, Enrica again has just made a really important point. Actually, that for her, Zoom is a wonderful opportunity for international networking and training. And not only that, but 17% air quality improvement over the last 6 months is a real plus as well. So so it's really interesting how a constraint maybe for you and I, because we can't meet face to face, is an opportunity to others, and that's a really liberating dynamic, if you like. Sorry, please carry on.
No, and in fact, that's just reminded me of something, in that, you know, very often people will frame things in the negative. You know, we talked about some of the things in the earlier questions, and it was all pretty glass half full stuff. There's always that ability to put it in a different perspective and reframe a negative into a positive. For any of you coaches out there, I'm sure that's staple diet in the way that you work with your clients, because very often, mentioned before, thoughts become feelings. And there's that famous quote from Henry Ford, you know, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you know, you're probably right. So it depends where your mindset is in there. I think closely what goes with what we said about perspectives and response and reaction is this thing called empathy. And that really is not understanding, in a sense, the feelings of the other person, but what sits underneath the feeling. So very often people don't want to hear, well, I know how you feel, I had something similar. The fact of the matter is you do not know how they feel, even if you ask them, because very often you don't really know how you feel yourselves. So that sort of, it can be seen at a surface level as being slightly condescending or patriotic, but sometimes supportive. You know, you can understand it from their perspective and the understanding of that feeling, but try not to relate directly to that feeling itself. It can sometimes come across in a negative way for them. And I put a great one up there, which is don't become or don't be an archaeologist. And what I mean by that is don't dig up the past. Okay, we're future focused, we're in the present. We might want to look in the rear view mirror to see what's happened, but we don't want to dig it all up, because when you dig up negatives, you start to, it's like an anchor for all the negative associations and thoughts that go with it. You want to focus on the goal in the future. What is it you're here to try and achieve? And that's going to come through communication.
Yeah, you can't move forward by looking in the rear view mirror.
You can use the past to inform the future, but you also run the danger of history repeating itself if you don't pay attention to what's gone. It is a fine line, Keith, but I suppose my advice is don't spend too long there, because you start to cultivate all those feelings and emotions, and before you know where you are, you're back to square one, really. And what you're really looking for is, what is it that's going to take you to the next level? And just a couple of key things actually, just calling out from here. One thing I don't think people generally do that well is this thing called listening. Okay, so, and listening is not just hearing what people are saying, it's about having a present mind. So it's clearing your mind of all the distractions and your own internal dialogue and being completely present for that person. And, you know, listening goes further than just hearing and understanding people and replaying back what they've said using their own words. It also means looking out for other signals as well. So for the public speakers of you out there, you will realize that very often 70% of what somebody says gets leaked through body language as opposed to the words that you share. So it's looking out for all of the visual cues about how people come across, you know, what was that hesitation in breath, you know, or that sudden closing of the arms or the glance away. What does that really mean? Are they really in the room? Are they really being party to this conversation? So just subtle things to look out for there. And the other one I just wanted to call out in the top right of that screen is something called expectation versus agreement. And I think, again, this is closely linked with communication. We've all been in those business meetings, particularly if it's led by some authoritarian or sort of, dictatorial style of leadership, where they'll sort of close the book and say, right, everybody get that, and they all walk out the room, and people are sitting there, well, what just went on there, or what happened, because nothing was actually agreed or cemented in place. And expectation versus agreement is really, really key. You've got to be on the same page. You've got to be, as they say, singing from the same hymn sheet, because if you're not, you will get these mismatches. Where you get the mismatches, you get poor performance, underperformance. You could even get overperformance, but the overperformance part is just not required. So again, the goal setting on the expectation, lay it out clear so that people understand. In the world of communication, it is the responsibility of the sender of that communication to ensure that the recipient has both received and understood that message. And a great leader and a great communicator will make sure that is the case. I read a book very recently, it's called Deaf Tips. It's about how deaf people communicate, and clearly through sign language and stuff. But very often where you've got some partially deaf people, they will do the classic thing, which is arrange themselves in a circle so they can actually see one another, okay? And they won't say, does everybody understand that? They will say things like, did I explain it correctly? It's a closed question, but it allows people to come back and say, yes, you did, or no, you didn't, or could I please clarify this point? I think going back to Keith's point from the very start of the session, at times in these circumstances, you've got to be quite courageous to step up, step in and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Can you just please repeat? Or can you just clarify this point? Or actually say, I understand this as, is that correct? Particularly when you're on the hook to get something done. There's nothing worse than walking away, not really knowing what you should be doing. And of course, the longer you leave it to go back to that person, the worse these things get. So I've put on there, you know, red wine. And what I mean by that is, you know, bad news or letting things fester is not like a fine red wine. These things do not improve with age. And I've also put up there, grasp the nettle. Okay, and what I mean by that is when a nettle starts to grow, it will only have 1 or 2 leaves, you know, which potentially could harm you or sting you. If you leave it, you know, you're just going to go nowhere near it because fundamentally it's just going to be too difficult to sort of pull out of the ground. And I think as well, David, just to come back to one of your very earlier points, how can you not have conflict in your life? And the only simple, surefire way that I have found is avoidance, as in no interaction. So cut those people out if you can. You can't always do that, you know, particularly in the work environment. But if you can, disengage with those that are causing you grief. No interaction, no communication is probably certainly the only way I've come across of avoiding conflict. But again, to talk about it from a positive perspective, for me, it's all about inclusion and input. And, you know, as humans, we're all social creatures, so we really want to get to know and understand where other people are coming from. So it's best to include them in that conversation. Anything else that came out from that slide or from the conversation we're having that people just want to either contribute or share a comment on at all?
I think the response, the react, is really important as well. Respond. So don't go berserk. To somehow remain calm while discussing is a real discipline that I wish I had more of, and certainly I wish everyone else had a bit more of as well.
Yeah, I think a great one that sort of anchors into that as well, Keith, is the one I've put up there on breathing. You know, we do it tens of thousands of times every day, but we don't necessarily do it that effective. And one of the techniques I sometimes use at the start of my coaching sessions is the 4x4x4 technique, which is the breathing through the nose for 4 seconds, the hold, as your diaphragm raises, hold the breath there for 4 seconds, then slowly exhale through the mouth for 4 seconds. If you repeat that cycle of 3, maybe 3 or 4 times a day, that can help improve your mental and physical state. And it's that classic thing, like, you know, when you feel yourself getting pressurized, you know, just say, take yourself, count to 10, you know, just to calm yourself down a little bit. Breathing is a really great technique to improve one's state. And if you read up a lot on all of this, there's that guy Wim Hof that's got books on all this sort of stuff. It's amazing. You can get books around breathing, but everything in the mindfulness and meditation world has probably got something to offer for your own personal state management as well.
May I just contribute an experience this morning?
Yes.
I had a new commercially orientated senior chap at a client we've worked off and on with for 12 years, has been given the task of reviewing what we've been doing this year and where it's got to. They're at a bit of an impasse internally. And one of the Max came on a bit heated on Monday, but we finished up with a level-headed conversation, which was about explaining to him what work we did, why we were doing it, and how we did it. So he was okay with that. But this morning's conversation, he did creep in the old, well, you know, I'm not comfortable with the fees you're charging.
Well, just on that, so sorry, Nigel, just respond in a second. Negotiation has come up at least twice in this thing. Bobby mentioned it earlier. David, I'm not trying not to go into sales mode here, but we're going to be covering something on negotiation going forward, because it's a massive, massive subject in all of its own right. But you're right. It comes out of, it is conflict. It's procurement and sales coming together like that, or whomever it is. We will cover that. Sorry, let me just hand back to you, Nigel. I'm also conscious. We've got about 13 minutes.
Oh gosh,
there's a bit, but
I just want to talk to Ralph's point there. I get the same sort of thing. Sorry, I think it was David. Apologies.
Yeah, David.
I get the same sort of thing on occasion from clients as well, and I think it's all about positioning that value and positioning things in outcomes. And a really great story I tend to share with some of my clients that think that we've got a bit of a mismatch around commercials or price. And it's a story that involves Picasso when he was alive and well, I think in the early 70s. And he's sitting in a restaurant in Vienna or Paris, and he's just doodling something on a napkin, just drawing something out. There's a woman across the other side of the restaurant that sees all this happening, comes across, introduces herself and says, "Can I buy that napkin off you?" Picasso looks at her and says, "Absolutely, it's yours, $10,000. This woman looks at him and says, $10,000? That only took you 5 minutes. And all he does, he looks back at the woman and says, "No, it took me all of my life." And I think in that, you just need to really emphasize your value proposition, what you bring to the party and what you can offer to that person. They're not just paying for your time, David, for what you do for them. They're actually paying for everything you've done way before that point. You know, it's a bit like when David Beckham used to take free kicks for England, and 9 times out of 10, they'd go in the net. You're not looking at that going in. What you're not seeing the 10,000 hours on the practice ground of him doing all of that. It's a bit like the Olympic sprinter. You know, Usain Bolt, you're judging him on 10 seconds to win the gold medal in the 100 meters final. What you're not seeing is the 4 years of preparation that went into him being able to get onto that start block. So I know it's not really related to what we're talking about here on conflict, David, but certainly values and outcomes to a client, and you can decide, of course, whether it's worth the journey with them. But that's certainly how I position myself. And as Keith has mentioned, I know we're running a bit short on time. What I would say, if there's things on that sheet that you want to speak to about me or Keith about, we don't have time for now, please reach out after the session. I'm more than happy to have a conversation. I would now like to just move forward and say very briefly, for those of you that were on the DISC day just 2 or 3 weeks ago, you can get major conflict between the different styles of extroverts and task and people focused individuals, just because we work at a different pace, we work with a different level of detail, you know, and we've got different styles and personalities which come out. So again, if you want to know anything more about DISC, please reach out to me. There are some massive conflict areas in that, just in terms of you know, reflective people and outgoing people, just that clash of personality style, which means that you can't move at that same pace, which actually contradicts on both sides. And I'd also like to leave this tool with you for reflection. This is the Thomas Kilmann model, and it's really about something to reflect on and where you actually may be on the assertiveness and cooperation scale. So the assertiveness goes on the Y scale and the cooperation along the X scale. You know, are you primarily in it for yourself? You know, we had a thing called ego come up a little bit earlier on one of the feedbacks. Where do you actually sit? And I did say at the start, I actually feel that compromise is not a win-win. I actually think it's a lose-lose. We really need to be, as in any natural 2x2 grid, heading towards the top right corner, which is about win-win collaboration, because that's the only place you're going to be where you've got I'm okay, you're okay. So if any of you guys out there are familiar with transactional analysis, you'll notice some of the other states there. I'm not okay, you're not okay, so I don't care about your needs, and I don't need you to satisfy my own needs. You know, that pretty much, David, going back to what we spoke about earlier, is the avoiding or the delay or putting things off. But I'm trusting that you can see that there's some elements in there that you've seen in either your personal or business career, and really it's just something I want to leave you to reflect on, in a sense, because you know, different times and different environments and different motivators will all be in one of those different places where we want to take part in various things.
Just 1 second, Nigel, making this up on the fly, and to everyone on the call. Ordinarily, I'd wind this up at 12 o'clock on the dot, but actually we've had lots of really interesting discussion. I understand completely if you, I know Richard does, have to leave at 12 o'clock, but Nigel, let's just kind of carry on if you like. Let's take that constraint off, because I think we're going to be okay. And everyone will get, if you've registered for this, everyone will get a link to the recording. But I completely understand if you've got to log off at 12 o'clock. But let's, because there's some really good stuff coming up, and I don't want to lose that sort of dynamic, if you like.
So just to be respectful on time, Keith, should we wrap up to the end of the session and then rewind? Because there is some input we want to get from people naturally. And what I'd hate to do is, for those that need to jump off at 12, we don't get their input to the final pieces. Is that okay? So what I'm going to do, I'll move off from this slide. I'm going to finish it by 12, and then we'll rewind back to, for those that want to remain on the line and pick up in a suitable place. So my next slide was, this was just a personal reflective question, if you could share with us about, having been through this webinar so far, what are some of the things that you may stop doing or even start doing, or perhaps do differently as a result of perhaps some new thoughts, something you've heard, maybe something you've said, or maybe some newfound awareness of, you know, something you weren't aware of before?
I think for me, that statement just a minute ago about what has it taken for me to get to this point, because for me that's kind of directly linked to the source of the conflict that I experience. And actually I've just literally brainstormed and jotted down a few things, and actually when I think about, you know, the last 8 years of education that I've been through, and the cost behind that, and the commitment and the working at the same time and all of that, and I actually sit and think about what I've invested to get me to this point to be able to deliver this project, actually I kind of think, yeah, why the hell shouldn't I ask for the price that I'm asking for? So that's really kind of resonated with me, that has, so thank you.
Good. No, that's fine, thank you, Bobby. And I like the one there about stop worrying. I heard a great phrase a while back that worrying is a bit like praying for bad things to happen. And for the majority of us, actually, many of the things we worry about actually don't happen, or certainly don't manifest in the way that we think. And it just leaves us in a negative mindset a lot of the time.
Can I just venture in on this one? Kind of worry, because I can talk about this. There's something that happens when I'm in the dynamic sometimes that I almost fall apart. But given that we're in a safe space just now, to Bobby's point, and I'm sure many others, is just say no. See what is the worst thing that's going to happen? Just no. That's not my model. Anyway, see what happens.
Yeah, we're getting into the topics of other webinars here, Keith, but that's a really interesting concept, because
you have certain rights in any situation. You have certain rights, and you have to also included in there is the right to assert your rights, or the right to say no. Now, how you say that is a very different thing. Sorry, Nigel, please carry on.
No, that's a really great one, because of course, you know, that really comes down to what's important to you in life, and very often focusing on the right thing does mean not saying yes to everything. And if, you know, typically you classified yourself earlier in the disc profile, Keith, as an I. Typically they are people pleasers. They don't like rejection. They don't like loss of popularity. So saying no is really, really difficult, but it can also bring a whole raft of problems with it as well. And thanks everyone for the input to this. As I mentioned earlier, all this will be collected and collated into the PDF from this session, will be sent out to you afterwards. And just a little bit of feedback on how myself, Keith and Sue have done as a webinar team today, in terms of, you know, were we prepared? Was it easy to jump onto the webinar? Was it well communicated? Did the registration process work well? This is useful feedback for us, such that we're able to improve what we do for the future. Okay, thanks. Thank you for that. Interesting. So, yeah, my maths teacher always told me when it's 1 to 4 is round down, and above 5 and above is round up. So I think we're looking pretty healthy on a lot of those scores. Maybe some homework, Keith, to do maybe on the registration process. But
just a point of disclosure, I haven't contributed to that because that would be a conflict of interest. Speaking of conflicts.
Okay, thank you everyone for that. And just really to finish off the session, Keith, I don't know whether you want to talk to this one at all about the timing of your webinars.
So just quickly, when I first started doing this, I was only going to do it for lockdown, and it's proven to be really, really popular. And 11 o'clock, most of us are going to be at home. We're in a different place now, 6 months hence or 5 months hence. And so I'd really be grateful for everyone's real-time feedback for what's the best time for you for a webinar that you can not just record, but participate in line. I'd be very grateful for your feedback, or even to the 5th one. If an evening one, I'm only ever going to do for payment. So let me just be very capitalist about that. But I'm happy to do these or something on it free during the day. I'd be interested just to know what kind of works with everyone. It looks as though 11 o'clock is the most popular slot. So that's fantastic feedback. Thank you for that, Nigel, too.
Thank you. And I think we've heard negotiation as one, but is there any particular topics you'd be interested in either myself or Keith either talking about or getting some guest speakers in? Be useful for us to know so we can continue this series of webinars. If you've got particular interest in a field, or in fact if you've got a particular desire maybe to present something from your own field. Okay. I think the one on active listening, I think, Keith, you've probably got something in the locker on that one already. It's a fascinating subject. And if you go through some key exercises, you can start to see how ineffective most people are actually at listening. Something on resilience there, which is great. Performance management, spiritual awareness. We might need to get someone in from the meditation community on that, but that sounds really good. Emotional intelligence, yeah, I think that really touches a chord with me, particularly around empathy. I think that's, from my perspective at least, is probably the #1 skill any decent leader needs to embody.
Yeah.
There's some really great subjects there. Thank you so much. And I think just to actually conclude this session on time at 12 o'clock is for me to really say thanks so much for your time and input. If you do need to leave us now, thank you so much. You will get both a link to the video and all of the material contained in this webinar in a PDF format, I guess either later today or tomorrow. But for those of you that want to remain behind, then please do so, and I'm more than happy to just dive into open conversation about any of the things we've spoken about. So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. I'm going to stop recording now.